I think it's fitting that we talk about dating and marriage because they are, or at least they ought to be, very closely connected to each other. I know in our culture, dating is sort of just seen as what you do for fun, and then marriage is what you do when you've already had too much fun and now you've decided that you want to settle down and have a family. But I think from a biblical perspective, as I will share with you, that dating, if it exists at all, which some people might question, is about considering whether or not we would do well to marry a person. So what about dating? Does the Bible even talk about it? Well, some verses certainly leave it out. Genesis 2:4 says, "A man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And doesn't seem to mention any prerequisites about, them having spent a certain amount of time together or anything along those lines. And definitely the biblical picture is different from what we see in America today. I'm not sure we really see anything like dating as it commonly is done today in America. And some of that may indicate to us that there's no precedent for the kinds of things we do today, and maybe we shouldn't be doing them. At least it shows us that most cultures throughout history were not like us, and that should make us pause and kind of wonder why that is. So I want to present to you what I think is a better way of looking at the situation, and then it'll be yours to decide what to do with that. But I do think you see in Scripture that it's appropriate for single people to have a say in whether they marry and who they marry. There are certainly indications in the Bible that happens. So I could be super close-minded and just say, well, I don't see the word dating in the Bible, so there's nothing like that. You just get married right away. But there's actually some indication that people have some say in this situation. So I wanted to look at dating, or some of the aspects involved in dating, from a biblical perspective. And so this kind of shows us the history of how people did things in the past. It also shows us what God saw fit to record, and we might have some insights into why he recorded those details and what insights we can draw from them. So, for instance, in Genesis 24, Abraham's servant has been sent out to look for a wife for Isaac, and he finds this girl, Rebekah. And then he goes to her family to talk to her about this, and they said, "We will call the girl and consult her wishes." Then they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" And she said, "I will go." Thus they sent their sister Rebekah and her nurse with Abraham's servant to his men. So there was at least some consulting of what she thought about the situation. This admittedly is a far cry from what we consider dating today, but it's something that seems a little bit gentler than just saying, like, you're just going to go with this person. We don't care what you think. Maybe another example that's a bit more like what we commonly see today would be in Genesis 29, 9 through 12. Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Now as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. So he sees this young lady, and immediately he goes and tries to help her out and be a gentleman towards her. Then it says, "Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father." So not typically the way we think of relationships today, but you can see the fact that he notices her, he goes, he does something to get her attention, he kisses her, and then whatever he said to her made her want to go tell her father about it. So these young people are sort of coordinating the situation on their own. They're having their own input here. And then it says, she went and told her father, and Jacob loved Rachel, and he said to her father, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, but they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Now we know there were some other complications about him finally getting to marry Rachel that come along in the book of Genesis. But the point I'd like to draw out here is that Jacob sees the situation and he makes his intentions known, and then Rachel responds favorably and goes and talks to her father about it. And it's kind of like they coordinated the situation. So you see that all the way back a long time ago in history, and recorded for us in the Bible. Then you have Judges 14:3, which is in some senses certainly an example of how not to do things. So Samson's talking to his parents, His father and mother said to him, "Is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives, or among all your people, that you go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she looks good to me." So we know this didn't go over too well. There are some problems. I mean, even the wedding didn't go over well at all for Samson in this case. But he wasn't listening to his father and mother, so that might be one warning to us, at least to take their opinion seriously. But then you have this other perspective of how Samson says, "Get her for me, for she looks good to me." He isn't basing his desire on some aspect of her character. He's just basing it on physical appearance. And probably if he took the time to know a little bit more about her, he would have foreseen some of the serious problems that happened. So that's a warning to us, to those of us who are young people, if you're dating or thinking about dating, not just to base things off of physical appearance. Probably the most extreme example I'm aware of is in the book of Ruth. I don't know if it was shocking, but I feel like a lot of what happens in Ruth would have been shocking to the original readers. But Ruth and Boaz know who each other are, and Boaz has this respect for Ruth. He knows she's a hard worker, that she takes care of her mother-in-law, and Ruth knows that Boaz is a good man and a generous man. And so then Ruth's mother-in-law gives her this advice: "Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do." She said to her, "All that you say, I will do." And we know that she did that, and she ended up being married to Boaz. So I don't think we should think that the Bible is just this incredibly strict book about how things should be done, because that's a little bit not what we would have considered to be traditional right there, especially for her to kind of be the one who goes and makes her wishes known to Boaz. Of course, then he took that and made the decision to continue and to pursue that marriage with her. But again, you see them having their own input in the situation. And I think, again, in this case, you see them basing their decision on things they know about the other person, on the character of the other person. Another example might be in 1 Samuel 25. So Abigail is married to Nabal, and he's about to go and destroy Nabal and his whole household, but Abigail comes out to stop him. And he says to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me, and blessed be your discernment, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from bloodshed and from avenging myself by my own hand." When you think about how God said in the beginning, "It's not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him." I wonder if David saw in Abigail some things that he would make a good helper. He saw her discernment, and he realized that she was helping him even when she wasn't his wife. Then it says, when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from evil. The Lord has also returned the evil doing of Nabal on his own head." Then David sent a proposal to Abigail to take her as his wife. Then Abigail quickly rose and rode on a donkey with her 5 maidens who attended her, and she followed the messengers of David and became his wife. So again, he's admiring something about her character, and she's very respectful to him and her interactions with him in 1 Samuel 25. And then he sends a proposal to her, and she responds favorably to that. Now, of course, Song of Solomon is probably the most prominent example in our minds, and it seems like Song of Solomon follows progression, where in chapters 1 and 2 they are dating, but it doesn't seem like they're married. And in chapter 3 it's getting closer, and then you see his marriage procession coming through at the end of chapter 3, and then chapter 4 is a description of a honeymoon. And then it goes on from there, and it seems like the rest of the book is talking about them when they're married. So if any book talks about dating very specifically, it would be Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, as people call it. And I mean, it starts off with her saying, "May he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Tell me, O you whom my soul loves," that's how she addresses him, "where do you pasture your flock? Where do you make it lie down at noon? For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? If you yourself do not know," then he responds, "most beautiful among women, Go forth on the trail of the flock and pasture your young goats by the tent of the shepherds. So they're obviously very interested in each other. They will respond to each other with these phrases like whom my soul loves, or most beautiful among women, and they want to spend time with each other. You find this interesting progression where in verse 6, she seems sort of self-conscious about her appearance, and then throughout this chapter, he compliments her, and then at the end, you see that she seems to have more of like a positive self-image. She says in chapter 1, verse 6, "Do not stare at me, because I am swarthy, for the sun has burned me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me caretaker of the vineyards, but I have not taken care of my own vineyard." Now, it's kind of funny that in our time, often the people, whoever they are, the people who are deciding what's beautiful, are telling us that someone with more of like a good tan, a darker shade of skin is more attractive. But in this time, you didn't want to be tan, you wanted to be pale. So she kind of felt bad about the fact that she was tan from working in the fields. But then what he says to her, he says, "To me, my darling, you are like my mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with strings of beads. How beautiful you are, my darling, how beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves." And then you find her saying at the end, or at the beginning of chapter 2, "I am the rose of Sharon, the lily of the valleys." It's like he's given her this positive view of herself in his compliments to her. You see this refrain several times before the wedding, where she will say, "Sustain me with raisin cakes, refresh me with apples, because I am lovesick. Let his left hand be under my head, and his right hand embrace me." And then he says, "I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the hinds of the field, that you do not arouse or awaken my love until she pleases." And I think that might be notable that she repeats this several times, especially before you have the wedding that comes along at the end of 3 and then in chapter 4 and onward. Especially this part, "not to awaken my love until she pleases," as if Solomon is trying to give us this wisdom about waiting until that commitment is there to have a certain level of intimacy. And then you see here, it sounds like they could be on a date in chapter 2, 10 through 14. "My beloved responded and said to me, 'Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. For behold, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone. The flowers have already appeared in the land. The time has arrived for pruning the vines, and the voice of the turtle dove has been heard in our land. The fig tree has ripened its figs, and the vines and the blossom have given forth their fragrance. Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along.'" So he's inviting her to come along with him. It's kind of like this picture. It's springtime, and love is in the air and all of that. So they seem to be going on a date. She repeats again in chapter 3, verse 5, "I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the hinds of the field, that you will not arouse or awaken my love until she pleases." So she repeats this one last time, this warning or this statement that she wants to withhold some level of her love until there's that commitment in place. So what I would draw from this is that it's appropriate for single people to have a say in whether they marry and who they marry, but physical and emotional attachment prior to marriage is very minimal. And as far as I know, if you look at Song of Solomon, I'm not aware of any indication that they weren't already engaged when the book was beginning to be written. So you could try to argue and say, well, they didn't know whether they were going to end up being together or not. But it seems pretty clear that they have this commitment from the very beginning. You see a similar situation when Joseph is engaged to Mary, but they haven't actually been married yet. And yet it says when she was found to be with child that essentially he was going to divorce her. And to us it's weird to say, well, how can you divorce someone when you're not married? But the idea is that the engagement was truly a firm commitment, that they were going to be married. And I think it's within that context in Song of Songs that you see them, referring to each other as the most beautiful and beloved and going off together and all of this when they aren't married. But especially if you look at this idea, it's appropriate to have a say in whether we marry and who we marry, and to develop reasons for wanting that. That physical and emotional attachment is minimal. And you can just look at these situations and see how they're different than what we normally do today. And in Genesis 24, Rebekah was asked if she wanted to go with Abraham's servant, but she was not invited to go and spend several months with him and become romantically involved first and then decide what she actually wanted. In Genesis 29, Jacob had his eyes on Rachel, and he agreed to work 7 years in order to marry her, but not to spend time alone with her for 7 years and then decide if he wanted to keep her. In Judges 14, Samson said, "Get her for me," but he didn't say, "Let me try her out and decide if I still want her." You know, even for Samson, who tended to be pretty rash in his decisions, that just wasn't the practice that we would see a Jewish family who wanted to submit to God's will doing. Ruth is interested in Boaz, and like I said, Ruth is definitely, I think, the most shocking one of them, the most unexpected perhaps. So she makes this gutsy move. She shows Boaz that she is interested in marriage, but Boaz basically has to make a decision then and there about what he's going to do. You know, it's not like then they enter into this extended period of secret meetings or something like that. That's when the decision is made. In 1 Samuel 25, David admired Abigail, and he waited patiently until the time was right to propose to her. And then he invited her to be his wife, you know, not to hang out and decide if things would work out between them or not. And then the Song of Songs, Solomon and his beloved admire one another, and they spend time together. But like I said, there's no indication that their marriage itself is not already arranged. I think that's probably why Song of Solomon is so different from the others. So that gives us some things to think about for sure. It's going to look different in different cultures, I think. There's a lot of for instance, modesty would be another issue that's going to vary from one culture to another. But you can see, especially in the words of the woman in Song of Songs, this caution about becoming too intimately close when that intimacy is not protected by a commitment. And I think if you look at the practice of so many today, there's a very high amount of close intimacy without any true commitment, and then people get hurt time and time again, and we get this sort of disenchanted view of love that you have to withhold your hearts from people because they're going to crush your hearts and all of this. And in the ancient world, I don't know if they had to worry as much about that because you just became married and then took it from there. So what does the Bible say about marriage, and what can that tell us about dating? So far it's been sort of this introductory material to look at what we see that could be comparable to dating in Scriptures. But maybe we can start to get more specifics in asking what it should look like today if we ask what the Bible says about marriage, because it certainly talks about that, and then sort of make inferences from that of what we would know based on those facts about marriage. To start with, marriage is presented in the New Testament as a practical arrangement, but not as a perfect one. And therefore, dating is about finding someone you can spend your life with, but not someone who is perfect in every way. You know, it seems like our culture has almost a sort of fairy tale view of love, that you need someone, you know, you hear people just saying, they're my everything, they're my world, you know, they're the reason I wake up in the morning. And that's sort of this picture of love that we paint. And then, you know, if someone has one small imperfection, well, then that can't possibly be the person that's right for me. You see something really different in 1 Corinthians 7, 8, and 9. Paul says, "I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it's good for them if they remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion." You know, Paul doesn't say if they find, you know, their perfect Prince Charming who has no flaws, then it's better for them to marry. He has this like really practical view of marriage where it's like, well, it's better for them not to marry, but if they don't have self-control, then they should marry. Like he's giving them a reason to enter into marriage that isn't exactly as rosy as we would probably expect someone in our day to talk about an entrance into marriage. So to me, this says marriage is not about spending life with your perfect soulmate. It is, at least in this passage, sort of this practical arrangement for people who can help fulfill each other's needs. So what does that mean for dating? It means we're not looking for the perfect person, but we are looking for someone who we can spend the rest of our lives with, who we can be faithful to, who can help us to achieve goals that are important to us. Another one from the same passage, actually, is that marriage is entered into as a safe place for the expression of sexuality. I mean, if you look at the different aspects of human life that we experience, one that is so emotionally powerful is human sexuality. And marriage is sort of the safety net that keeps that power in check to really protect society, to help build a stable society. And thus, dating should be practiced in such a way that self-control can be maintained. I heard a man in a sermon once say this, and I've repeated it several times because it really made an impact on me. He said, "I'm not stronger than Samson, and I'm not mightier than David, and I am not wiser than Solomon. Therefore, I am not immune to sexual temptation." You look at all of these men who were so notable for being godly or having wisdom or being strong, and yet they fell to these temptations. And so that's a warning to us to be especially careful about the situations that we find ourselves in. So we read this passage. He talks about how marriage is sometimes appropriately entered into, for these individuals at least, because they do not have self-control, as how Paul says it. I wonder if that's even a discussion for modern people, and even modern-day Christians anymore. I mean, who talks about maybe we should get married because it's hard for us to have self-control? And normally what I hear is, well, maybe we should wait to get married because, we want to finish our school and we want to get a career and experience that for a few years, and we want to do all these other things. And that's why, we decide when we want to get married. If I could be pretty frank for a moment, I think American Christian parents, at least, expect a great deal from their children when they have no problem with them being alone with each other, with no accountability for as long as they want, but at the same time, they're just absolutely certain that their children are not going to be tempted to become sexually involved. I don't know. I think Paul had a more cautious view that you see coming through here, and it's at least something worth thinking about. Another aspect of marriage we see is that it's about making a bond that lasts for a lifetime. Therefore, dating should not result in a series of bonds being made and painfully broken one after another. And I think that kind of shapes the way we view love in our culture, perhaps more than we realize. Matthew 19:4-6, it says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." You think about what I talked about, for instance, the powerful nature of human sexuality, and just other aspects of marriage, such as the companionship and the help that is offered, and how strong of a bond that creates. And God laid out this pattern. People call it leave and cleave, where you leave your parents and cleave to your spouse. And I believe our hearts know that path already, and they're ready to follow that path. And they don't really know what we're doing when we start trying to go halfway down the path and, sort of fall in love, but sort of not, and because we don't have full commitment, but we feel like we have some commitment. And you just don't see that kind of a wishy-washy picture painted in the Bible. And marriage is about putting the needs of the other before your own. Therefore, dating should not be about putting ourselves first. We know Ephesians 5, a very common passage on marriage, says, "Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. As the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything." And says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. Each individual among you also is to love his own wife even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband." The picture is one of people submitting to the needs of the other. And it's not typical for us to look at dating that way, because we live in a consumeristic culture where, we look at things and we think, well, what can that do to make me happy? How can that serve my needs? And if that's not the primary role in marriage, why would it be the primary consideration in dating either? I actually saw this guy on the internet the other day. He was talking about what he called fish love. He said he saw this young man saying that he loved fish. And the guy said, "You love fish? Is that why you pull it out of the water and, beat it to death and boil it and eat it?" He said, you love what the fish does for you. And he said so much of what we call love is fish love, meaning I love what the other person can do for me. That's not the same thing as loving the other person in a way that makes you want to do what's best for them. You know, if I love fish, I do what's worse for the fish, I guess, not what's best for the fish. The same thing could end up happening if we love other people for what they can do for us instead of wishing to do what's best for them. One final passage that we should look at is 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7. It says, "Love is patient, love is kind and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." Whether in dating or in marriage, I think we should look at this description and try to conform ourselves in our relationships to this description. Just one closing note. I realize that all this talk about like not being halfway committed and halfway intimate, since it goes against everything in our culture, it seems almost impossible to do in practice. It seems like I'm presenting an ideal to us. And so I want to recognize the fact that what I'm presenting is an ideal, but it's an ideal that I think we should consider seriously and try to figure out how we can strive for. How can we move closer to what we think God would have us to do? How can we submit any part of our lives that we possibly can to do as we think He would want us to do? I know it's going to be difficult. Whether you're thinking about dating or whether you're married and you're thinking about the aspects of marriage that we've talked about. But we've got to be ready to follow wherever Jesus leads us, even if it's difficult. So thank you for considering that with me.